What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing you a video on how to beat True Draco. I haven't done one of these videos in a long time, so I thought I'd go back to my roots. And you know, if you have a regional or a YCS coming up, since Draco has established itself as one of the best decks of the format, then this is going to be the video for you. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout outs today to Noah. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So Draco has a lot of complexity going on because although a lot of people just say, you know, it's masterpiece.deck, there's a lot of different layers in terms of how you need to approach True Draco, and when playing a single deck, you might be weak to one of three different points that Draco has to implement. It might be the monsters, the spell and traps, or the absurd amount of draw power that Draco has at its disposal. Now, ideally, we're going to tackle all three of these, but we're going to talk about some strategies on how to handle these three aspects, as well as some card choices that you might want to include when playing against this matchup. So, we're going to start with the monsters because I think Masterpiece and Friends are probably the most oppressive threats you have to deal with, but we're going to get to some of those other ones later in the form of spells and trap cards. But, starting off with Masterpiece. Masterpiece can pretty much just win games on its own because it has the built-in immunities of whatever it tributes, and depending on the matchup and whatever deck you might be playing, Masterpiece could become very problematic. So the most simplest way to deal with Masterpiece is just to run Kaijus. Now, the problem with Kaijus is that unless you're playing something like Kyoto Waterfront to be able to help search them out, and the only deck that's really playing that is World Chalice, you're kind of hoping to rely on drawing into these Kaijus, whereas your opponent is able to search Masterpiece through a myriad of different ways. But if you do manage to hard draw the Kaijus, or if you have enough of them in your main or side deck, then it shouldn't be something you have to worry about too much because you're going to have the answer for the Masterpiece, and that's one of the pillars that can crumble if you manage to set up that Kaiju, because by Kaijuing over the Masterpiece, they're going to lose just pretty much their entire board presence depending on what they may have in their back row, but Masterpiece is what keeps them in the game, and that's one of the biggest threats you need to deal with when going up against True Draco. Now, another more generic aspect that you could pretty much take when it comes to handling Masterpiece is utilizing a card like Borla Dragon. Now, Borla Dragon may be a Link 4 that does require 3 effect monsters, but because it can be played in the extra deck, you technically have access to it at all times in comparison to something like a Kaiju, which you're hoping to hard draw out of your deck. Now, one of the big weaknesses here is that Borla Dragon is not immune to the trap cards when they get sent to the graveyard and their destruction effect, because it's only immune to monster effects. However, if your opponent doesn't have back row and they're just sitting on a Masterpiece, or you know what those cards are based off of the plays they made in the prior turn, then summoning Borla is actually a very good option to get over Masterpiece, because since it's immune to monster effects, it can't be targeted by the Masterpiece, and that's good because it has 50 more attack, and that just makes it the perfect way to out something like Masterpiece. But do be wary of those trap cards, because trap cards will pretty much just annihilate Borla Dragon, and it'll set you behind rather far. Now, another option too is tackling the littler monsters, Majesty Maiden, as well as Ignis Heat. Now, one of the biggest things is with Majesty Maiden is that sometimes when the True Draco player uses Card of Demise, they have to ditch their whole hand in the end phase, so they're relying on Maiden as soon as you activate a card during your turn to get the Masterpiece out of the deck, and they're probably going to have the trap card to use as a tribute during your turn to not only set up Masterpiece, but also get the trap card in the graveyard to pop one of your other monsters. However, if you have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring for that Maiden, and you know they don't have any cards in hand, this can actually disrupt them rather well and prevent them from essentially having 2 layers of disruption, all for using a single card. So that's a pretty big payoff when you look at it in that perspective. But also when it comes to Masterpiece 2, there are other ways you can handle it in non-monster means, and by that, I'm talking about cards like Dark Hole, Raigeki, but very interestingly enough, Mind Control is a rather interesting choice, because if the Masterpiece isn't immune to spell cards, you can take control of the Masterpiece, and then in main phase 2, you can link into the Link 1 monster, Clara and Rushka, the Ventrilo duo. Now, this monster requires a normal summoner set monster to use for its link material, and since the Masterpiece essentially fulfills those requirements, it's a nice one card out to be able to deal with all of the threats, but most importantly Masterpiece in that True Draco matchup. Then you also have cards like Forbidden Chalice. Now, Chalice is important not only because it can make Masterpiece pretty much vulnerable to all different sources of removal, but because Amano Iwado is being very popular right now in pretty much all Draco decks as a whole, Forbidden Chalice allows you to negate that Amano Iwado so that all of your other monster effects are not turned off for the duration of the turn. It also leaves Amano Iwado on the board so that you're going to be able to kill it if you have a monster that can beat over 1900 attack on your following turn. So Chalice has a lot of versatility here and is a really strong card in other matchups as well, but because it can stop Amano Iwado, it's something you might want to include in your side deck. Then you also have the floodgates like Mask of Restrict. Mask of Restrict can honestly just win the game outright if they don't have a way to remove it, because if they can't tribute their spells and traps to be able to summon their monsters, they're not going to be able to pop Mask of Restrict with the spells effect to pop spell and traps. So Mask of Restrict can just outright win you the game from there. Now I want to deviate from the monsters and talk about the spells and traps, because that's just the second layer of essentially threats you're going to have to deal with when it comes to Draco, because Masterpiece is one thing, but when you're having to deal with all these different floodgates, when you have to deal with Diagram, and you also have to deal with the spells and traps not only for their effects, but also when they hit the graveyard, they're going to be popping cards on your field. That's a really big deal. So I want to go ahead and start off with pretty much generic spell and trap removal. Twin Twister and Cosmic Cyclone are excellent choices here. Twin Twister because it can remove 2 threats with 1 card and plus another card as cost, and Cosmic Cyclone in particular because not only does it remove a threat, but it also banishes it, meaning the spells and traps won't be able to trigger when they would hit the grave, but because they're being banished instead, it's going to mean they don't trigger, and it's going to protect the rest of your board. It's also good because you can hit Dragonic Diagram and the floodgates as well. In particular, Anti-Spell Fragrance, which is a very popular choice considering Pendulum is one of the best decks of the format. So if you're a deck that's very spell reliant, you're gonna want to have Twin Twister or Cosmic Cyclone coming into your main deck in games 2 and 3 to make sure that you don't get blown out by Anti-Spell Fragrance. Typhoon is also nice, even though it's not a spell card, and it requires your opponent to have 2 face-up spell or trap cards. However, it's a good card because it's not a spell, and it pretty much does what something like Cosmic Cyclone would do, but just in a different way. Now, one card that you can absolutely blow your opponent out with is Zaphion the Time Lord. Now, Zaphion can't be destroyed by card effects, which means True King's Return and Apocalypse will do nothing to it, but you can just attack into your opponent's board. Zaphion will shuffle away all of their back row, and that's huge because if they had to play Card of Demise and set all of their cards, you can pretty much shuffle 4 or even 5 cards back into their deck, making Zaphion an absolute blowout. So that's a card you definitely might want to consider in the side deck. It does require your normal summon, but if that's not really too big of a deal, Zaphion is just amazing. Then we also have some other cards as well that are good for dealing with these spells and traps. Unending Nightmare can be particularly effective because not only can you hit Dragonic Diagram, but you can hit, the trap cards as well that they might have, or anything else that might just be particularly annoying in that specific matchup. Then you also have Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, which is good against Dragonic Diagram, as well as True Draco Heritage or Disciples, depending on what you're trying to stop. It might not only stop the tribute effect, but the draw effect, or even just the searching capabilities of Diagram. Ghost Ogre is a very solid option in that matchup. But then we also got cards like Magic Deflector, which blanket just stop all continuous and field spell effects for the rest of the turn. And that's really powerful against Draco because it's not like they can chain anything to stop it since it's just a normal trap card. Magic Deflector was a very popular choice back during the True Draco Zodiac format, and it's still a very good choice today. You also have cards like Abyss Dweller, which if you're going first and you're able to set up an Abyss Dweller, in addition to the rest of the board you're able to make, that makes it so that your opponent won't be able to send their spells and traps to the graveyard and gain the benefit, which is what makes Draco such a powerful deck going second, because they can get so much value just by tributing off or destroying these cards with Diagram and slowly picking apart your board. But with Abyss Dweller, or even Macrocosmos for that matter, that pretty much makes that whole game plan completely nullified. The last card I wanted to talk about here is Evenly Matched, because this is probably the single-handedly most just massive blowout card you can possibly play play in the matchup. Now, some players might side Imperial Iron Wall for this specific card. However, it's very few and far between, and you have a slightly higher chance of seeing evenly matched than they do of seeing Imperial Iron Wall, just in the opening 5-card hand, not talking about additional draws. So you have to realize that if you have this card and they don't have Imperial Iron Wall, this card is just an absolute blowout. Very similarly to Zaphion, it's going to pretty much just destroy their entire board. It's going to banish their entire board, meaning nothing else will trigger. It's going to leave them with one card more often than not, and typically if someone sees evenly matched in the True Draco matchup, it's usually game over if it resolves. Now lastly, I want to discuss draw power, because not only are the monsters and the spells and traps in this deck very strong, but the draw power is really what gets the deck going and what keeps it fueled. You've got the ability to play every single powerful draw spell in this game in this deck. You can play Pot of Desires, Pot of Duality, Card of Demise, I could keep going on, and you also have Dragonic Diagram, which is its own form of searchability with 3 terraformings in addition to that. So how do we stop the draw power? Well, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is single-handedly the best card you could possibly use. You're gonna want to save this for the Card of Demise, because that's just being able to stop a 1 for 3 is massive, and that's typically going to really slow your opponent down, because sometimes they're going to rely on that Card of Demise to really get them back into the game, or really draw them the cards that are really going to get them there. So by saving Ash for Card of Demise, that's going to be your best bet. It does take some discipline because you don't want to use it on any other card. However, it's usually best saved for that instance. There's also cards like Droll and Lockbird, which it's going to allow them to get a single search through, but denying them the ability to get any other cards for the rest of the turn is absolutely huge, because that means they can't use their Desires, they can't use their Demise, they can't use any of these other powerful cards, and they're going to be locked in to whatever they have in their hand at that given moment. So while Ash is arguably a little bit better because it pretty much just denies them the ability and makes them waste the resource, Droll and Lockbird is also a very good choice as well. But then you also have spell and trap variations in order to stop the draw power, like Deck Lockdown, you've got Mistake, and you even have Imperial Order, which not only stops the draw power, but also just stops the other True Draco spells as well, which that makes it a very good candidate if you're looking to pretty much just blanket stop a majority of their effects, since over 50, if not 60 or 70% of their deck is comprised of spell cards. So by being able to handle Masterpiece and the smaller True Draco monsters, being able to handle this True Draco spell and trap cards and their destruction effects, as well as being able to play through the floodgates and handle the massive amount of draw power that True Draco has at its disposal, you're going to be on the road to easily beating True Draco. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think, and if you have any other suggestions for powerful tools when combating True Draco. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.